Welcome, welcome.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, hi. I'm noticing I have to let everybody in one by one, so I'll keep an eye on that. But we're going to start. This is Carmen. I've been explaining to folks that this is sort of a. Somebody said, "I don't think it can be the right at the top of the hour." I said, it's not a webinar. It's like when you go into a Kmart, if you remember those, and they'd go down the back, and there's somebody with knives, and they'd be cutting up tomatoes and bricks at the same time. And you're like, what is going? That's kind of more like what a salon is. So hopefully everybody
That is
enjoys.
the best description ever, I have to say.
Graham,
I do
what?
remember Kmart. I do remember Kmart's, but I don't remember anybody chopping bricks.
The Cutco
With a
guys
knife.
at the back, yeah.
Okay, some folks are coming in. That's great. Why don't we just go around at the beginning? We've got some space here, and we can just do some intros. Carmen, will save you to the last because you're so special. If that's okay.
Mhm.
You want to kick us off, Graham, and then we'll go over to Natalie?
Sure. I am Graham Harvey. I am a curious person involved in a million little projects, but most core to it, with the big ones that relate to this space, would be certainly Favor Up, which is a community facilitation project designed to build goodwill in communities and drop environmental load by facilitating mutual assistance, and a bunch of network analysis stuff around data usage and how people can interact better together. So that's my short.
Yeah, and I have to say, I like talking to Graham because he's got a good way of seeing how people move within systems. Like, yeah, just they move ideas, they move among it, they connect. What does that do to the system? It's always interesting conversation, I have to say. Okay, Natalie, you're up. And then Kalia. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Norton. I'm with Realized Worth. I'm a strategic consultant. I'm based in Northern California, where I think it was like 86 degrees yesterday. So we're cruising into summer. Um, and I guess one thing that has been really interesting to me lately is the idea of people systems and biomimicry, and thinking more about how we can measure things like that and think about the world in that way. And so, just something that's been on the top of my mind.
I like it. Thank you, Natalie. Okay, so Kalia, we're just going through name, where we're calling in from, just a little bit about us, whatever you want to say.
Yeah. Hi everyone, Kalia Johnson. I'm calling in from Arizona, so not too far from Northern California. I'm originally from Southern California. And it is 80 degrees here already at 10 o'clock. So I understand what you're dealing with. Summer is coming and it's coming fast. So I work for Boston Scientific. I'm in the corporate social responsibility team. I work with our data and a lot of KPIs and metrics. Um, yeah, I'm just here to learn, and I was just interested in the topic. Thank you for inviting me, and I just want to absorb as much as I can.
Awesome. Okay, and my name's Chris Jarvis. I'm in Baltimore. I'm a Canadian. Still living in the US for a while I'm still allowed. And I am endlessly fascinated by bringing some of the research and science and methodologies that are out there to the practice of social impact, whether it's nonprofit, government, or the private sector. But with the Institute, we try to make that connection possible. And so the Makerspace is meant to be a highly utilitarian approach to knowledge. So we don't come and learn something and then leave and reflect on it. When we come, we're like, I got to solve a problem, or I need to make something. But together, the idea of in a collective action network, we make the future we want. And so I want to go around in a second. I'm going to get Carmen to you to just do a quick intro. But then, since we've got a nice small group, which these are designed to be, a lot of the people who signed up, and hello to everybody on the recording, signed up to get the recording because they didn't want to miss the conversation, but it just didn't fit. Totally fine too. This is just what you need as you need it, how you need it, for what you need it for. So not pure science in any sense. Pure science would say we must know. But we're starting from why we need it. So Carmen, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'm going to come back to you, Graham, Natalie, and Kalia, to just share maybe what do you want to get out of it? Like, what was it that made you even sign up for it or show up for it? What do you try? Are you trying to make anything? If none of that, maybe you're just like, oh, I just need to be more informed on this topic. That's fine too. But we can go back around. Carmen?
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet many of you. And I was excited to sign up for this when Chris and Tim reached out because I love provocative conversations. And I love the idea of salon style, where it's not just about one person's point of view, but building upon each other's. So I'm excited about that. And I'm in New Rochelle, which is right above New York City, just outside the Bronx, 70 degrees and sunny. So hoping all my seedlings are taking full advantage right now. I'm a gardener and no, poor gardener. I enjoy it though. 50% successful usually most of the time. But my professional background is, began in the nonprofit sector, community and economic development, financial counseling, and almost 15 years ago switched into corporate social responsibility under its many names. And I've taken a data research focus to trying to support companies. I've been self-employed for about 4 years, and I do like a mix of strategy and measurement work for a whole set of clients. I have one NGO client right now, keep things spicy. And I love talking about measurement, and I love trying to push the envelope a little bit. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you all today.
Awesome. And I just put an about Carmen Perplexity page in there so you can check that out. You can actually, if you use Perplexity, you can make that your own and savor in your own little page of really interesting people I want to pay attention to. Perplexity allows you to dynamically add on to it, like explore different things about Carmen or things that she's talked about. And you can see that Carmen and I have done this before. We did one on measurement back when ESG was fashionable, which was, I don't know, just 36 months ago. It was all the rage. Now it still is all the rage, but in a different kind of more accurate way. Graham, why the hell are you here?
Sure. So, the two things. I guess I'll start by saying I'm in Canada and still looking at the last of the snow, wishfully wanting it away. So your 80s and 70s are really, I'm in the lower Laurentians, and
Very
it
unkind.
does covet a little bit. Beyond that, so you mentioned biomimicry, because I am in the very launch of a project called Living Idea, which is about creating a biomimicking vector for idea flow through networks. So it's like, couldn't, it was almost to jump in and jump on that. But the reason that brought me here more than anything else is I've got 4 or 5 major projects right at that foundational stage, that critical sort of defining stage. And I'm just, when I saw the topic, I was like, this is exactly something to stop and take a beat on, because so much accountability is there. And yet the accountability to what, for who, by what is all sort of in this space. So I just sort of like, yep, okay, I'm going to clear the time and sign me up, because this is definitely a conversation I want to get involved in.
That's awesome. So now I know what Graham wants to make or what he's making.
Hmm.
Natalie.
That's so cool, Graham. I want to definitely talk more about that. I'm here for a couple reasons. I mean, anytime Chris posts something, I definitely want to get involved. And Carmen, I've been following you on LinkedIn for years, so super excited to like have a conversation with you as well. I am big into benchmarking. I think that it's a really great way, obviously, to tell stories, but before Realized Worth, I worked in the nonprofit sector for a while. I've been a board member as well. And that's where a lot of my reporting background has come from. And so the power dynamics that exist within those relationships has always been something I've come to heads with. And so it's interesting to be in the Realized Worth part of the work as well, to kind of navigate these different worlds as we're all in the effort of creating more effective partnerships and what that can look like and how data can inform that. I also have a little bit of background in monitoring and evaluation in the nonprofit sector as well, so bringing that perspective. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, what was the big nonprofit you were working for before we scooped you up?
Rise Against Hunger.
Right. And just to
Yeah.
put it in perspective, size? Give me some numbers so we can understand the size. Either
Uh,
reach, dollars,
yeah.
people, just anything.
Yeah, I mean, our budget was 7 million. We were fundraising for 7 million a year in the corporate sector alone, and that was about 70% of our budget. We impacted probably, I mean, we talk a lot in like meals packaged would have been like the way we would have formatted that. Definitely about 30 million to when I left, closer to 70 million meals a year would be packaged largely by corporate volunteers and distributed internationally.
Okay. So what I did there was just trick her into telling me the most important metrics she thought would define her work, which is meals,
Yeah.
it's output, dollars raised. Okay, so it's interesting. It's interesting. Okay, okay, good, good, good. Uh, and I gave up Natalie before you, Kalia, so you don't have to worry about getting trapped.
Yeah,
There's no,
thanks.
you're good, good. It's a trap. Okay, no, it's not that.
Always.
Thank you. I would say the reason why I joined is because obviously the title of who decides what counts. I think that's a big conversation right now in the CSR space, because there is no standardization. And so I'm curious to learn and to hear, as well as just in terms of my job, one thing that I've been focusing on a lot lately is data. I do a lot of external surveys, internal surveys, gathering data, trying to aggregate all sorts of things, right, into those key priority metrics. Um, and one of the things that we did recently was onboard True Impact to talk about some of that data with our charitable giving, and that's helping us standardize. But at the same time, we've never had key priority metrics, so trying to bridge and fill that gap and get us to more of the standardization without pigeonholing our nonprofits and telling them what they need to track, versus collecting the data. There's a fine line between just collecting anything and everything and trying to speak to it versus telling them like, hey, we need these key things. So I'm interested to see, just learn from you, Carmen and Chris, about what you've seen in the sector, and just make a pitch to more standardized data tracking in our space, because it is a bit of a mess. So
Nice. I like that. And Kali, I should say we have a separate project in our genome lab where we're trying to standardize the employee volunteering metric itself, like what counts and what doesn't. It's on a spectrum,
yeah,
obviously. But we're trying
yeah.
to take sleepovers with your daughter. That shouldn't count as probably employee volunteering for the industry. And then secondly, how did you count it? Some people still use
Mhm.
photographs and pick and count people in photographs. And then just use a bit of a math equation to go across their entire company. And then the last one is, did anybody count what you counted? Like, how would you verify, how would you prove that
Mhm.
this is an actual number?
Yep.
The internal count or whatever. But just those standards could be
Mhm.
very helpful. So I'll send you some info about that as
Thank
well.
you.
All right. Okay. So again, Salon. So what Carmen's going to do is she's going to give us some things to think about along these lines for about 15 minutes or so, and then we're just going to have a conversation about it based on what you need to get out of it, what Carmen has talked about, wherever we want to go. It is very much a small conversation. I told Carmen, it's like what I'm shooting for is like, you know how when actually you go to a conference and then after the whole day's over and the reception's over and you go downstairs and all the cool people are hanging out at the bar. Well, there's some uncool people over there, but you try to stand over here and not catch their eye too much and you sit with them and you have this amazing conversation. And that's what you remember from the entire conference is what you talked about at the bar and the connection you made and the insight you gained. That's what we're shooting for here. So not too much pressure, but just don't screw it up, Carmen, and over to you.
I only have a large jar of water, so I'm gonna stick with that for now. But okay, so the prompt for the salon discussion that I saw, where is it here? Who defines value? What gets left out? And so I really gravitated to this idea of who has defined value. And so I have three groups of people that I want to talk through. And I think I have a liberatory alternative to current state of affairs for each one of them. So, and I would say this is when I think about measurement for conversations like this, I think the practical reality of doing the work that we all do, you're always sort of like straddling between the immediate needs, the past operations, how things have been done, and then trying to see how you can find the corners and the pockets where you can sort of like push forward into new directions. So I'll say that as a caveat. When I'm saying some of the things I'm going to say, it's not that I'm practicing that, I think, 365 days a year. But the first one I have is, who decided that outcomes data was the only thing funders should pay for? So I'm calling it, I wrote something a while back, which I was calling it sort of outcomes supremacy. And I date it back to finance professionals, corporate professionals, impact investing thinking. And I want to go back there, but should we let our new friend introduce themselves, or should I keep going, Chris?
Well, you can keep going. Tomomi, she's on the team. She's one of the ones who I was
Okay.
saying, don't worry. It's like
Don't
knives and
worry.
bricks.
Okay. All right. So who decides outcomes data? So what was this? Where did we get this sort of like focus that the most important data, the best data, the good data is outcomes data? And that's in a reference to the logic model definition of outcomes, which is we only want to see data about changes that have occurred over time. So I trace it back to 2 points. One is sort of like in the early 80s when people started to get really excited about logic modeling and theories of change. And it was like, we're going to move away from what people think is most important or care about personally. And then we're going to get serious. We're going to get scientific. There's going to be models. And so that began sort of what is still rolling now. You know, everybody asks, do you have, to nonprofits in particular, do you have your theory of change? Do you have your logic model? Sometimes funders have them also. And there was a move in like the 90s, early 2000s for social impact bonds, pay for success, where an impact investing in general. So it's like, we're going to use this information now and we're going to increase the pie. We're going to get more money because we're going to focus on these outcomes and then we're going to buy them. We're going to put more resources towards these proven results. So I call that into question now because I think we can look back on this era and say that this focus exclusively on outcomes data as the best data has distorted the ability to expand resources. Instead of helping people pick between two organizations, I believe that it has shifted organizations to certain issues that are well equipped to measure outcomes. So workforce development programs, entrepreneurship programs, asset building programs, financial counseling. That's where I was in my nonprofit years. You can look at a credit score. Did it go up? So instead of having the effect of really expanding the pie and finding organizations that were most impactful, it caused something else to happen with flows of funds and the expansion of the nonprofit sector. People started to say things like, we've got ROI over here, so why don't you have it over there? You need to show me your ROI. I've got 2-to-1 ROI. I just saw a piece, it was a large NGO that got published in the World Economic Forum saying they have 20-to-1 ROI. If you give us $1, we're going to put $20 of wealth into women's pockets. So that could be true through their study, but this idea that outcomes data is the only good data is problematic for all those things that I just said. It also created a tone where people feel uncomfortable questioning that. Like maybe they're not smart if they say that they think other data is also important, or they're not professional enough, or they're not sophisticated enough. So that's about the power dynamics now, right? Because now only the people with that outcomes data and the ability to represent and speak to a model are the valid voices in the room. They can say what good data is, and other people are now quiet, you know? So what's getting left out? What's getting unsaid? You have to be pretty courageous to challenge someone who's sort of representing that. And that can be in a meeting, you know, with a funder. That could be, you know, a nonprofit team meeting where someone's like, we got to get this data. Someone might say, I don't think that sounds right, but they don't want to necessarily challenge it. So that is my first sort of like, who decided, and this is why it's problematic. And I would say the liberatory alternative is to just start talking about outcomes data as good data for certain issues. So it is okay, I think, in many cases to say that you need outcomes data if you're doing a workforce development program, or you need outcomes data if you're doing financial counseling work, things like that. But there's other places where it's not good. So that's number one. Number two, so who decided reach data needs deeper scrutiny? So reach data, number of women, number of students, number of meals. We said that we need to go further than that. And I would argue that group of people are people trained and educated in social impact, trained in evaluation. I got a master's in nonprofit management, and I was taught different ways to sort of like dig into that. And similar to what I described with like that corporate professional, like this is the data that's important and I have power. The same thing happened in this case, where now we've got evaluators and academics and social impact professionals, and it changes the dynamic of how we can talk about the data, which is sort of what I would consider the core data in many cases in social impact, which is what did we produce? Like we said we were going to do this, and how many people showed up? How many people stayed in the program the whole time? The microscopes started to come out. Neighborhoods became laboratories instead of neighborhoods, and we're going to study what happened rather than, reorient our attention to people who might be experiencing the thing that's being studied and ask them what they think should be done. So one of the problems with that is that I think there's a lot of shaming language. So we'll say things like it's not sophisticated or it's not meaningful, or all that negative language that we hear and that we're trying to kind of move away from in other things in our lives about the way we look, or people's professional backgrounds or educational backgrounds. We want to use better ways to describe that. It happens from bringing in more expertise has had a negative effect of not allowing us to talk about in sort of like plain language, average person terms, the data, numbers of students, numbers of hours, numbers of migrants trained, et cetera. So I think shaming language is a big problem. And the other problem with that is that we started to think like, because we say that the reach number doesn't matter, the output number doesn't matter, then that would imply that it doesn't matter if you reach 10 women or 50 women. Doesn't matter if you had 25 students or 100 students. And so we sort of like skipped over that, and we only want to hear if like the women feel more powerful in their future life, or if the students had professional success. Can we explain it? Can we scrutinize it? Can we, make sure that it's real? And in my opinion, then we missed an opportunity. So where was the standardization opportunity? That's where it was. We could have gotten really strong with how we talk about the immediate work of nonprofit and social sector organizations. We could have standardized whether we touched, engaged, or served a community or person, an individual. And then those big numbers, which every nonprofit has, and they should, and they're good, we could scale them and think about the different amounts of resources that it would take, whether you're doing a light touch, a medium touch, a deep touch with an individual. You're seeing someone all the way through a major life change. What does that take? So I think that standardization has gotten misfocused, let's say, focused on standardizing outcomes, which are not feasible to standardize, and missing an opportunity to standardize what could have been some really, really rich data. So the liberatory alternative, which I have spoken to people at Candid about, and they're like, oh, that's interesting. It doesn't really fit within their taxonomies currently, but what if we standardize touch, engage, serve, or some iteration of that, and had some really, really rich data we could analyze across the sector on that. So that's the second. And the third is, what if the people that the data represented were in the decision-making seat for what the data looked like? What would they be comfortable sharing? For how long? Did they finish? Who are they? Instead of saying they, what if I said me? Like, what would I be willing to answer? If I was with a therapist for 1 year and they wanted me to fill out a survey and say, did I change your life? How would I feel about saying that? If I finish a course and they say, are you more confident now? How would I feel answering that? Would I be willing to tell them my gender, my, educational background, everything, all these personal details? I would guess, based on a lot of the things that we're seeing in the world of evaluation and measurement, people are comfortable saying, were they there? Did they complete it? Providing information about their experience there, probably providing a few details about themselves. And that's about it. Like if you think about if a gym came back to you 2 years later and they were like, do you feel more fit? Do you feel more well? Did we do that for you? There's something about assigning credit to another organization, another entity for anything that I've done that you kind of like, why are you asking me that? Like I did that, you helped, but like, let's make sure that we're clear on what we're saying. And so to me, that is how we're sort of like shifting the credit by some of the desires for the impact data that's out there now, when we could be focusing on that core information of people's experience and who they are. And then that reorients us to where there's that standardization opportunity. So in this case, I have two liberatory alternatives. No metrics solution moves forward without a nonprofit majority as decision makers, not a majority of nonprofits, but even True Impact. Before they launch a project of how they're going to analyze data, if they've got 3 of their staff members there, they need 4 nonprofit professionals at the table to agree that the direction they're going with that data is correct. Impact Genome is another one. How many nonprofits were involved in how they decided to standardize their piece, their products essentially. And Candid, who takes a lot of flack for housing so much data and how they share it or don't share it. But I would say they move really slow, partly because they do try to engage nonprofits and sort of listen and try to find that balance. So even if they're not all the way where they should be, they are taking the time, and the way they present the language about the nonprofit data that they have, it refers to it as someone else's data that they are the steward of rather than their data, which I think other companies don't necessarily do. So the liberatory alternative is that people working in nonprofits have a vote, essentially. Obviously, the ideal case would be people with the lived experience that the data represents, but I would say that's probably one step too far. And the other one is that we stop referring to nonprofit measurement as a monolith. So how can we get more specific? Just like I did with outcome supremacy. It makes sense in certain issue categories, right? So in what cases is it appropriate to expect nonprofit voice to be the decision maker? And let's talk about exactly who, which organization, not speaking theoretically or at a higher level, but instead getting really specific and saying, in these cases, it works. It works, and we're going to start in New York, and these numbers of nonprofits and these leaders are going to come together, or we're going to start with a certain issue, because I think sometimes I've been in many measurement conversations, we start speaking sort of like abstractly as a sector. Funders do this, nonprofits do that, and I think whenever we should be able to advance now in 2025 going forward and get more specific about which groups we're talking about, subgroups within any of those. So that was a lot. I don't know if that was 15 minutes or not, but we started with finance, talking about pay for success, pay for outcomes, liberatory alternative, separate, creating groups for when outcomes should be the good data. Then academics, evaluators, thinking about standardizing. Touch, engage, serve was the liberatory alternative. And then reorienting who gets to decide back to the people who the data represents. No decision without nonprofits at the table, and getting specific, not referring to sectors as a monolith. So those are my 3. I hope that sparked something for someone, and I hope you disagree. Also, it doesn't have to be all about agreeing. I think this will be great to build and challenge them also.
That's amazing. And if you have the chat open, and at a salon, you should always have the chat open, you can see a summary for Carmen's 3 points there, as well as the one you just gave us, Carmen. You're going to get all of this stuff, all of your comments, everything afterwards, so you can continue to use it. Yeah, let's see. What do we want to talk about? I have some questions I want to ask. While you're thinking of your question or response, let me just ask this one. The last point you made was about the tension between measuring a group and involving the group in the measurement process itself, right? Is that correct, Carmen, on point 3?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. In it's community-based participatory research, which is an approach that from the very beginning, setting up what would be measured, how this data would be used, the entire thing, you involve the subject in the process to some extent. It sounds like you're taking that approach, but the subject in your examples were people who represent the sector. So it's a nonprofit, maybe not the nonprofit or the community that we're working with, because maybe there's not an identifiable community around the issue you're trying to measure, whatever. So what is your understanding of that approach, community-based participatory research? Terrible title for it. Does it satisfy some of the concerns that you had around measuring without involving the subject?
I guess it's very possible that it does. I think like those sort of things to me are the signal that everyone's kind of like, we might not be doing this quite right. You know, like it's still a research model. People are still being referred to as subjects, but which I think sort of there's something there that feels a little bit maybe funky. But it is an acknowledgement that there's a change is shifting. Another change that I've seen is like people are being paid to respond to surveys or to do interviews. So a lot of models now insist that people are paid if they're going to have to sit for an hour and give their experience or respond. And that to me is also a signal that everyone's like, maybe we should be more inclusive. I would say it's even, if we're going salon provocative, it's that there's not a study. It's a nonprofit is running a program, and the people involved in the program, they're like, hey, we want to know your race and how long you've lived here. Are you okay with that? Yeah, we're okay with that. Okay. Oh, no, we're not. We don't want to answer that. Like, hey, we want to do 2 surveys. We want to do a survey in the middle and a survey at the end. Do you mind filling that out as a participant? Yeah, we're fine with that. No, we're not okay with that. Like the ability for people to have decision-making authority in a simple way. I think that that's another thing that is a problem, is that everything now feels like a study and very distant versus like, just ask somebody, are you okay with doing this? Before they're put in a position where they have a pre and post survey, even for something simple, like a, 6-week resume workshop or something.
Okay, good. That has, I have another follow-up question. I'll write it down. Anybody have a question, comment, your experience? Now, remember, this is about you. It's just you extracting be utilitarian. Don't be nice, be provocative, get shovey, get what you want and walk away and slam the door when you leave.
I guess I have a thought going back to it made me stop and pause, right? Because I said earlier that we're working with True Impact, and a lot of it is outcome data based. And your comment about it not being important to speak to those outcome data points in certain situations is like, it just makes you pause and reconsider where you're emphasizing that in certain programs versus not. For me, I think it's very clear when we look at volunteer data and employee matching gifts, right? There isn't a clear connection with outcomes data. So to me, that's obviously a point where we talk more about reach data. But with corporate grants, maybe it's a little bit easier to get to those outcomes. But I wanted to ask, are there any other like clear examples that you would recommend, or that you have seen, that either somebody's focused on outcomes and they really just need to start focusing on reach, or vice versa in this space?
I think it's what you do with each type of data. So like
Okay.
the issue breakdown. So like I have like a little list here, like where I would say, oh, this is off the top of my head, but like where outcomes data might not be the only way to have good data: protecting people's
Yep.
rights, trauma-informed care, facing
Mm,
addiction, advocating for living wage, domestic violence. Like it's more about the issue, because
mm,
what happens when you search for outcomes data is you could end up causing harm. So now someone's in mental health care and they have to like also fill out a lot of surveys to track their progress, and they're gonna, so I think like it's thinking about when is outcomes data accessible naturally. And that's why the lists that I gave, like wages, financial counseling, entrepreneurship, like it's very natural. Or education is another one
mm,
where like there's tests and scores and graduation and college, and so it's natural. And it doesn't cause, like, you're not trying to like find the data. And some people will say like, oh, just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But I think that's the wrong framing. It's like, is that appropriate? So I talk about
mm,
reach and results. You can still get results. So if you're running a mental health program, you might say we had 50 people at the beginning of the year and we still have 45. 50, like people might say like, oh, that's not an outcome, but you're using data. So I say you're using data to communicate, you're using it to manage, and you're using it to learn. So manage is the one people don't like to talk about as much. Communicating is reporting, but like you're managing. What does the program manager want to know? What does the executive director want to know that the funder's not asking them? Like they're trying to figure out like, how can we do better with the mission in mind, you know? So that's one thing. And then I would say like if you want to think about good data for volunteering, it's about how you're using it. So you've gathered information, you feel like it's credible, and now you're going to make some decisions. You're going to set some goals. You're going to say like, this is where we feel like we're not reaching this group of people, or etc. So I emphasize use as the best practice for what makes good data. Like we're really using this. This is telling us things, and people want to know it, and we pull it up in every meeting. And that's how you know it's good data, you know?
Yep.
Let's
I don't know
peel
if I
that
answered your
back.
question. I feel like I went on a tangent. The salon is throwing me off because
Yeah,
I'm
no, no,
like,
it's good. It's good. Kalia, think of a follow-up if you've got one. Anybody else? But Carmen, I want to peel back a little bit. Dan Heath in his book Upstream, he identifies how we problem solve, and he gives a little upstream comes from the fact that, you know, these two people come across the river and there's all these kids floating down the river drowning, and they start jumping in, throwing them out. And then there's more kids, more kids, more kids. And finally, one of them walks away and he says, "Where are you going? We got to save these kids." He's like, "I'm heading upstream." Where are they coming from? Like he's going upstream to attack the issue at a higher level. Now, to do that, it means that he has to wander into some ways to find information what the problem is. And we use surveys to do that. So he tells a story in Boston. They were looking across the city and they were allocating funds to repair sidewalks based on the number of calls that were coming in from those communities complaining about them. And they would go out and they'd solve those problems. And they identified the high problem communities. And then somebody just went out and talked to people. And they realized that the people in the Black communities weren't calling because nobody came anyways, and their sidewalks were a disaster. But the data said it was perfect. Hardly ever have to go for a repair. They're fine. So the data actually told them they were in great repair. That got folded up into future costs, expectations. So there's this big blind spot right there because of the way that they were collecting the data, and because they didn't understand the dynamics producing that data. So while some data is widely seen and understood, it's lying, right? Poverty, level of poverty in this country, number of people who are homeless, the issues around them, all of that data is lying because it is protecting a system that needs to operate a certain way. And so we are not going to redefine level of poverty because statistically, the data will tell us we are a highly impoverished country and no president is going to do that. So how do you handle that? Like I just come to it and the other thing is, you know, John McKnight at Northwestern University, he has this approach called asset-based community development, ABCD. And basically when you go, they would send people around and they'd say, okay, what do you need? Do you have a high school education? No. Oh, do you have any health issues? No. Do you have your teeth? No. Are you partially blind? And it's this huge deficit, a deficit of emptiness, and you can't build anything on that. So he's like, instead of measuring what's missing, you go out and you measure the assets that the community has. How many people do you know in the community? It's a whole different kind of set of connections that shows cohesion, connection, ability. And so there's this way of, because you said, look, there's some data that's readily available and it's just, but even that, I think in our highly capitalized system isn't truthful data. And yet a lot of our programs, policies, legislation is built on it.
I mean, I think it's a little philosophical for me. I think like I think if you dial back to like a CSR example, you know, like you want your partners to report you're doing, you know, an after school program and you think that it helps kids go to college, and you find out that they were pretty much on track to go to college. And this is like their last mile nudge, you
Yeah.
know, this is helping them. But is it getting them to college unilaterally? No. So what do? Is the data lying? You know, like, is it untruthful data? To unpack all of the systemic issues that led to that moment, I think connect to some of the things that I've said, which is like people, if we only think good data is outcomes data, we've created an incentive for organizations to make sure that they're producing outcomes, which means who do they work with? So, you know, you're right that a lot of times the people in the position to choose like what is the big metric or what is the big number want to make sure that the reporting is a good story. And so I think if we think that data, I think that data is for communicating, learning, and managing, acknowledging that need for positive communications, and that if we're realistic, is going to be there. So this is our reporting. We have these 3 metrics that we report on. And then for our management, we have 10 other things that we want to look at. And this maybe is not public information because people don't have the depth of detail and understanding of the complexities of the issues we're facing to look at it. So we're talking about big numbers outside. And I don't think we should shame that, you know, like that is that like a company says how many they sold and how many investors they have and how many employees they have. Like that's just the nature of data in every sector. And then what's behind the scenes is the where you're really digging into the details. So it's like not stopping, you know, whether you have the like is it truly lying or is it truly false? And yes, of course you have a big issue, you got to take action, you know. But also saying like, is this the perfect metric to represent the whole story? That's rare. It's always going to be that data has like a very it has to be specific to certain things, and then it has to change every year. Once you know something, you have to change, you know, like, okay, we already know that this is our rate of math majors that are enrolling in our programs. We've got that down. Like, what else do we need to know, you know? So, anyways, I've gone down another tangent, but
No,
back
no,
to your
that's
original
good.
point, I would say if you have unethical data, you need to change it. But if it's not quite perfect data, you might just be sort of dividing it. Like things have different purposes, different uses.
So in the chat, I just put the question that that I think kind of captures where I was coming at with involving people in an asset-based community development and not seeing people just walking into a community and deciding, are we going to needs-based or are we going to go asset-based? Changes the data, changes the story, changes everything. But we're going to leave that for right now. And I really appreciate you digging into that. And I want to give the mic back to anybody else standing around that wants to see you cut through a brick. And I have to explain, Tiana and Melanie, you joined. That's just, I'll explain that later. That what I mean by cutting through a brick. But just welcome. Feel free to come off mute if you want to ask a question too, or you can just drop it in the chat if you're not able to speak.
I'll go. I got a internal conflict. This is wonderful. You've raised a really interesting paradigm shift, I think. The utility of the data and the implications of the normalization of that utility over time in terms of what we then can do with it, but also then what that does to the whole ecosystem. I guess the part that I'm sort of struggling with a little bit is, on the one hand, I see that if we decouple the sovereignty of any of these points and rather say, let's look at the whole thing and like what is good what is good data for communication, what is good data for management, what is good data for learning and understanding, we get a whole bunch of a better story. And I can think of examples of that where people have been able to say, we can't explain why this is happening. Let's just say, is it happening? Let's just like leave us in that unexplained state to get a better result and so forth, and to get a better understanding. But I think the part that I'm not sure of is when you talk about the historical flow that's happened here, which is we've kind of created this monster whereby the funder, let's just take that journey, but it's true for all 3. To take the funder journey, there's an expectation set in the funder community now based on having been conditioned around the data that's important, that now is limiting. So if we just acknowledge that as a case and then say, okay, where's the intervention point then to break that cycle? Because if you don't speak to it and suddenly step outside of it, I think there needs to be a compelling other thing to be, because again, there's a competitive element to the funder conversation that I think can't be minimized in this. Because, and I'm just curious as to what you think in terms of the cycle of decycling that process.
I think so. I think there's a lot of ways that we could look at data if it was described differently. So like we use the logic model as kind of like one of our only ways to really categorize the data from social impact sector. And like if we only described personalities as introverted and extroverted, we would know we were limited, right? Like that's not the only way to describe a personality. So to describe a data point as only an output or an outcome, to me, is where we're really sort of hitting our heads on a wall. So I use results, reach results and reference. So people don't like reach data because they don't think it's meaningful. So I recommend bringing in a point of reference. So if it feels not useful to talk about 300 hours of volunteering, providing a point of reference gives that person a way to understand the number, whether it's last year, whether it's another company's version, whether you're comparing two different business units or teams. And you're right that I'm like, whenever I talk about like this topic, I'm always like, I am a lone ship sailing on the ocean. And it is, but the way I look at it is like this: everything is a link in a chain. Like the focus on outcomes had a purpose. It was a good thing. Like it had a good intention. And now it's more about like, what's the next evolution? What's the next iteration of our understanding of how we use data? Can we shift the role of data for the sector so that it becomes a little bit more connected to management? We think about like in the measurement training I do, I have this piece about like, there's just systemic flaws to the way nonprofits were set up that we sort of look to individual nonprofits to solve when it's actually systemic. So like, there's no hub for data, right? Like if you need GRE scores, you can go to GRE and get all the scores and compare. You know, there's medical databases, there's healthcare, and in the case of the social sector, there's all these disparate places, right? So instead of saying like, let's build one, we could say like, let's acknowledge that that's the state of affairs for the nonprofit sector, and then try to use and get our data better within it. I would say it is a paradigm shift, and it's sometimes a swimming upstream. Another thing that I do is like in like trying to create an application and a report, it's not just asking for data, it's asking for methods. So asking nonprofits, do you use a software or do you use spreadsheets? Which software do you use? How many people are involved in data collection? Like it's a new set of information about the role of data inside the organization, and try to do that without judgment. But then you're comparing methods, and you're also looking at numbers and the actual results. So I think that that's one sort of practical application of trying to shift away from like, we only want to know your outcomes. And like, let's hear more. How do you combine, interviewing people a couple times a year and surveys? Those sort of things I think are really telling about whether or not an organization has found good ways to define data's role for them.
So Carmen,
But it is a big problem, I think, because people want to feel sophisticated and smart, like they don't want
do you know much about Giving Tuesday's effort to consolidate some of this data and make it accessible? Because you worked with them or on some of this work, right?
I was involved in some early meetings, yeah.
Okay. Do you know anything about where they are in the moment? I just stuck it for the group. I just stuck up a few links to where things are at with them.
Feel free to share if you want to give an update.
Nope, I don't.
Oh, okay.
That was a very legitimate. No, nowhere.
Yeah, I'm not on the cutting edge, that's for sure.
All right, cool. What else do we want to talk about, folks? What else do you need to make? Think about what you want to do. Can we bring it right down to something very practical for yourself? Because I'll keep going to, first of all, can you describe liberatory versus extractive data cycles? What do you mean by that? Or you use the word liberatory.
That was from your thing, like what's a liberatory alternative?
Okay, then if it's not your word, then don't worry about it.
Well, actually, I can give one thought, one thing that I've envisioned. So I know there's now like multiple software companies are trying to think about AI generative models where organizations aren't reporting individually, but you can use technology to sort of project outcomes. And a challenge there is where does the data come from that feeds those models? And so to me, an extractive model is I have your data already and I'm going to use it how I want. And you might have somewhere in your email inbox that you could opt out of this, but can you find that? And do you even know you have that? And if we want to build that for the sector, what if it had more of a Spotify model where any organization that offered its data set to this future you know, whatever that would look like, they get pennies on the dollar like artists do on Spotify every time it's used. And so in that way, it's a little bit more democratic, and you know, people have privacy concerns in sharing their data, but I'm sure they also feel like I'm about to lose control of this information. This is, you know, my data, my organization's data, our clients' data. So what do I do with that? And so I would love to see the that to me is also like, it's not the same as what I was saying about people have like a vote on what's built, but it would, you know, create some buy-in and help people feel more connected to whatever, however those tools might evolve.
All right, let me jump in right now. Like every good YouTube, there's always a commercial in the middle. This commercial is just before we wrap up. Oh, and Tiana has a question after this. If you want to have more of these small, focused, very accessible conversations with interesting and amazing people like Carmen, Graham's going to be doing one on systems and mechanisms, and it'll be very cool in it there. But we have these salons all the time. They're free. Bring your friends, bring your family, bring your kids. And then if you want to dig in and actually do some work, you should think about joining the Makerspace. We have these labs. The first set that are running and are booked out are practical AI. How do I use it? Just to do like real simple things. Like this is, you will leave saving 5 hours after the first lab a week, easy. So that kind of thing. So be sure to check that out. I'll include that in the follow-up. That's the end of the commercial. Let's go over to Oh, and by the way, it's the Makerspace that's bringing this to you today. Okay, over to Tiana.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm calling you from my house and as I'm in transit.
Thank you for jumping on like this. That's so
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's any time that I see you, Chris, doing anything, I'm like, I got to jump on. So I'm in the employee engagement space, and I'm seeing vendors increasingly move towards like data, but like data as in outcomes. Like sharing outcomes with employees is going to drive engagement. And I see this all the time where it's like you give $25 and it means that we do XYZ, like $1 is a meal. And I just really struggle in how are we educating our employees to like look beyond $1 equals something while also engaging them in a way that causes action. So I think I'm struggling with like, what is that fine line between like, sure, if you tell someone $5 will equal 25 meals, maybe they'll give $30, but also like thinking about how do we complicate that with like capacity building, with like how do we complicate it for people to say $1 doesn't necessarily equal this, when I feel like the field in general, because it's easier if people don't have to think as much, are, and I'm thinking really about like Benevity and Impact Genome. I guess how do I, as a program manager, help complicate it for people so they're looking kind of beyond the one-to-one, while also realizing, unfortunately, that's kind of the reality of why many people sometimes will give. So not exactly a question that can be solved in 5 minutes, but something I was just thinking of.
Does anybody else have I saw you hearted, Kalia. I mean, to me, it's like a legacy practice. It's almost like the overhead myth coming to life in donor, you know, like there's no cost. It's so simple, you know? So, but anyways, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No,
I was just gonna say, I think it's a wonderful question, and I completely agree that now a lot of the way that people are communicating on the corporate and the nonprofit side is, you know, if you donate $5, you'll provide a meal to 10 people. You know, it's but at the same time, I think the reason, and this is assumption, the reason why that we saw that shift start to happen was because there was a story and you could connect the dollars to a beneficiary, which I think is the piece that pulls on like an employee or a personal person that's going to donate versus not donate. Because I've seen just in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, a lot of people just want to know, where are my dollars going? Which can be problematic, right? It's like we want to give nonprofits donations. It goes back to that whole idea of unrestricted funds, but we needed to bridge the gap. And I completely agree. I think there's a way that we can, you know, pull ourselves apart a little bit and provide some more education maybe. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
And we got 4 minutes, Carmen, and then we're going to end right on the dot. So,
Yeah.
TikTok.
I'll just say a couple of things then. To me, what underlies it all is someone's managing to a participation goal. And so thinking about different ways to drive engagement. One thing would be sort of like how do we think out of the box for what anyone in the role of managing programs like that is driving towards for the year. So it could be like instead of a certain level of participation, it could be we want to see a certain number of new people engage with the program, or we want to see the average donation go from $15 to $25, or we want to see an increase in $25 donations, which means we're making our program more accessible to people at lower ends of the salary band. So that releases some pressure on like what are all the ways we can get people to click on this and do the thing. Which doesn't totally solve it. But I do think you're right. I saw a research from, I think it was Triple Pundit, that the numbers actually don't move people. It's a story. So like we did 10 million, we did 50 million, we did 100 million doesn't actually move consumers. It was about consumers, but I think it applies. It's like if they felt like it was clear exactly where things went, which I do think it's going to be an evolution for unrestricted funding to not feel like, was it my dollar? Like it's accepting you have contributed to a group that you trust and you're hearing a story and it's one of many stories that it's a little bit less individualistic maybe, but might get to the same place. But it's definitely, it's a thinker, something to think about, because I do think they're really problematic. It also undercuts it tries to make things about efficiency rather than about results. So 2 minutes to wrap.
2 minutes to wrap. Here we go. If you have another question or comment or query, come back to the next one. Join me in a creation station. Reach out, email me. Let's chat. This is the resistance of pro-social action against a future that none of us want. So if you want to be part of that resistance in a fun pro-social way, this is where we do that. I do want to just leave you with one thought, because not many people know about it. I think one of the reasons that numbers become primarily important in data collection for nonprofits because fundraisers use them to compel people to give. Most of those numbers, as Carmen said, don't work. But one that does work is pseudo-set framing. In fact, Chip and Dan Heath wrote a great book. If you want to turn people off, trigger the bias called avoiding the ask. That's a bias where I know if somebody's going to ask me for something, I will actually schedule things in advance not to be near them. Like we just hate knowing we're going to be asked for something. It's terrible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. So, but pseudo-set framing, this one's really interesting because Michael Norton, who I know, he's at Harvard, a very cool name drop. Then he wrote this and he's done some great work around bias. He was also part of the IKEA effect, that research. If we build it, we love it, even though it's not the best. This one here is, they did if you could buy a meal for a kid or 2 meals for a kid, or you could buy a meal for a kid for a week, which would you want to do? Everybody, there's this thing where it's like, you remember HBO would be like, okay, pseudo-set framing brings you to the and I need the whole set. People prefer a set over part almost all the time, unless they can't afford it. So pseudo-set framing becomes a really interesting way to raise funds, whether you know it's what you're doing or not, which means what do you need? I need really easy numbers that are easily quantified, that I can easily show in a chart, that are not showing the complexity of the issue and may not actually be addressing anything, but I can get some money out of it, or I can get the thing I'm asking and it works. So there's a utility there that I think kind of drives some of our thinking as well. Carmen, thank you so much.
Interesting. Thank
For
you.
your
Thanks, everybody.
time. Carmen is going to be around in the Makerspace. We're going to see her again at a salon. She might drop by some labs. We're doing that one on, like I said, defining the metric of volunteering. I'm going to drag her into that, whether she wants to be or not, because there's lots of cool organizations into that. But thank you, everybody, for being here. And we can continue the conversation, okay?
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carmen, you
Bye.
are awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. So are you, Chris. Bye.
Bye.